George Harrison was a man of quiet wisdom, spiritual depth, and artistic brilliance, someone who, despite being overshadowed during his Beatles years by the songwriting juggernaut that was Lennon-McCartney, eventually emerged as a powerful solo artist with a vision uniquely his own. And while his legacy is often marked by his gentleness and transcendent creativity, there was one figure in his story who evoked feelings of betrayal, disappointment, and even hatred. A man whose chaotic genius initially seemed like a perfect fit for George's ambitious solo dreams, but who ultimately became a symbol of everything George despised about the industry, about manipulation, about the way his artistic soul had been trampled in the name of commercial gloss and personal madness. That man was Phil Spector, the infamous producer with the Wall of Sound, a legend in his own right, but also a volatile, unpredictable, and eventually dangerous figure who left a scar not just on George's music but on his heart. Because when George first brought Spector in to help produce his 1970 solo masterpiece, All Things Must Pass, he did so with optimism, believing that the eccentric maestro behind hits like Be My Baby and You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' could elevate his post-Beatles material into something epic and lasting. And at first, the partnership seemed promising. Spector helped George build a lush, massive soundscape, creating an album that was widely acclaimed and commercially successful, yet beneath that success was a growing sense of unease, as Spector's personal demons, his alcoholism, drug use, paranoia, and erratic behavior began to seep into the recording sessions, with George often forced to work around Spector's absences, his strange demands, and his erratic moods. And what was worse, as the album neared completion, George began to realize that Spector had taken his deeply personal, emotionally raw songs and buried them beneath layers of orchestration, echo, and bombast, masking the vulnerable essence that George had poured into every lyric and melody. And although he went along with it at the time, perhaps out of politeness, perhaps because he didn't yet have the confidence to challenge Spector's reputation, George would later express deep regret, stating in interviews that he wanted to remix All Things Must Pass without the excessive production, to let the songs breathe the way they were originally intended. And that lingering dissatisfaction turned to outright disdain as Spector's behavior worsened, not just professionally but personally, as he continued spiraling into delusion and madness, showing up to sessions armed, drunk, and disoriented, forcing George to navigate a working relationship that felt more like babysitting a ticking time bomb than collaborating with a visionary. And the tension came to a head during the production of the concert for Bangladesh, where Spector's behavior became so problematic that George considered firing him mid-project. And although the concert and album were groundbreaking, the first major benefit concert of its kind, George would forever associate the experience with stress and volatility, haunted by the memory of a man who once inspired awe but now brought only anxiety and regret. And as years passed and George's solo career continued, he quietly distanced himself from Spector, choosing instead to produce his own records or work with trusted collaborators like Jeff Lynne. And in private, George didn't hide his contempt for Spector, often referring to him as unstable, untrustworthy, and more trouble than he was worth. And even when Spector was arrested in the early 2000s for the murder of actress Lana Clarkson, a crime for which he was ultimately convicted, George's associates noted that he had long predicted something like that would happen, having seen firsthand the darkness that lurked behind Spector's flamboyant facade. And though George had always preached peace, forgiveness, and karma, even his spiritual maturity couldn't erase the bitterness he felt toward a man who had turned a sacred creative journey into a psychological battleground. And perhaps the deepest wound of all was the sense that Spector had taken from him something irreplaceable: the purity of expression, the rawness of his post-Beatles emergence, and transformed it into something artificial, bloated, and impersonal. And while All Things Must Pass remains a masterpiece in the eyes of fans, George's own discontent with the final product haunted him for decades, driving him to revisit, remix, and reevaluate the work, always with the lingering sense that Spector had corrupted what was meant to be a spiritual statement of liberation and self-discovery. And in that sense, Spector didn't just betray George professionally, he betrayed him spiritually, emotionally, artistically, and personally, becoming a symbol of the very chaos George had tried so hard to transcend through his music, meditation, and connection to the divine. And while many figures in George's life brought him conflict, from Paul McCartney's creative overreach to John Lennon's dismissiveness, none seemed to leave the same bitter taste as Spector, whose fall from grace mirrored the crumbling trust, and artistic disappointment that George never fully forgave, and even as George faced his final years with grace and acceptance, there was a quiet fury that remained when he spoke of that time, a deep sense of violation that no amount of spiritual detachment could wash away. And while George Harrison was a man of love, light, and transcendent peace, he was also a man who valued authenticity above all else, and when that authenticity was smothered by another man's ego and instability, it became a wound too deep to ignore, and so, even though he never launched public tirades or media vendettas, those who knew George best understood that when it came to naming the person he truly
Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon.